I'm going to do a bit on behaviorism because it's one of those things that we use a lot and it has a huge influence on a lot of the work that we do around learning. So, for example, all of the learning objectives at the beginning of your textbook chapters come to us largely from a behaviorist tradition. So, this stuff impacts things everywhere. But we also don't necessarily think about what it actually means. So I'm going to do like a quick review here so we can understand it. Um, and behaviorism, as you might guess from the name, kind of assumes that the only thing that matters in terms of demonstrating human learning is behavior. It's what people do. So when we talk about sort of the behavior and the action in an educational context, we're usually talking about, for example, producing the correct answer, right? Um, and the reason here doesn't matter. Um, and that's that's maybe an oversimplification. It's not that the reason doesn't matter, it's that behaviorism's understanding is that the reason one produces a behavior over another is almost entirely and is always either because I get some kind of reward for doing it or because I will get some kind of punishment if I don't do it. So, this is sort of an idea of like your motivation, your intention, your understanding of what you're doing doesn't actually matter. And that might work very well when we're talking about some things, right? So, for example, if we're looking at your ability to do multiplication in a math class, right? On some level, you can be able to perform multiplication and meet an expectation for that a faculty member might have of you, and either like math or hate math, and it doesn't really matter. Okay? But when we start getting into sociology and a lot of the stuff that we look at in this kind of context, it is a lot more complicated than that. Because, for example, if we think about something like hiring, okay, and we have a lot of conversations in contemporary society about wanting to make sure that hiring is fair and unbiased, and we have a lot of conversations around, for example, diversity in hiring and whether or not women and visible minorities are getting positions at the same rate as other groups. We think that those are really important social ideas. But if all we have is behaviorism, what you wind up with is a situation where someone making a hiring decision to hire a woman or a person of color because they think that person is competent and suited to perform the role is treated as identical as someone hiring the same woman or visible minority person with an understanding that, well, this person is less competent and less useful, but I'll get credit for having a diversity hire if I hire them anyway. And even from that short description, I imagine most of you can tell, like, oh, wait a minute, that's different. That's not the same. And so one of the things that you need to understand in behaviorism, in terms of how we understand that as a process of socialization, is that it's really useful for some things. Okay? It's really, really useful, and the whole idea of how we talk about how that behavior rewards, how you get rewards or punishment for that kind of behavior is really, really interesting, especially if you go back to our conversation around seeing the strange and the familiar from Unit 1, from Module 1. Especially in terms of how we look at things that don't make sort of logical sense, or that don't make sense on the surface of it. So, for example, usually when we're talking about things that people do that, wait a minute, that doesn't make a ton of sense, there's a reason. They are receiving some kind of reward for that or some kind of punishment for not doing it. So when we sort of look at that from that perspective, that can be very helpful. However, when we talk about behaviorism, there is absolutely a limit to this piece, which is that there are some outcomes that we might care a lot about in terms of learning, in terms of understanding, that we just can't measure through a behaviorist lens because It's about someone's internal experience, right? And I imagine many of you have had an experience of walking into an exam where you felt pretty confident about how you were going to do. Okay, you're like, I'm walking in, I know I'm going to do pretty well in this exam, it feels pretty good. And you've also had an experience about walking into an exam going, I really don't know what I'm doing. I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm so anxious about this exam. I think I'm going to fail. I think I'm going to do really poorly. And you probably recognize that those experiences are very different and that it might be a valuable goal to talk about making students feel more confident as they approach their exams. And as much as that might be very useful, behaviorism can't tell us anything about it because the behavior doesn't change. The score might not necessarily be any different. And so we have to understand the limits of our theories. And that's one of the reasons why in sociology we keep a variety of different approaches, because all of these approaches have limits. There are questions they answer very well and questions they don't answer very well. And so we have to understand what those limits are. Behaviorism is very useful. It's great for making predictions, very, very helpful. But it doesn't explain, anything about anyone's internal experiences, so how you feel about doing that. And there are some cases where learning to feel more comfortable is actually super, super important. I know I have some students who are sort of aiming in terms of psychology, and sort of psychological treatment is often a sort of space about that, where you want people to feel more confident in their own judgment and that kind of thing. So there's that piece. And then the second place where behaviorism isn't, like, it's just not well suited, like that sort of second piece, is that behaviorism isn't good at explaining why people might be different, right? Because according to behaviorism, since all that matters is rewards and punishments, and people's internal experience doesn't matter, the same rewards and punishments should work for everyone. And I'm sure, again, all of you know that that is not the case, just from your own lives. So that kind of question about what the limits of behaviorism are kind of important, and one of the things that we needed to talk about.